want to better phrase, call her doll-like. She was very, I think, very unique-looking child. She'd got very pretty, blonde hair in a bob. She was quite a petite child, and, she's very bubbly. Very, she's a very good child, too, to interact with.
The cadaver dog froze, its body suddenly rigid with attention. Then came the alert, that unmistakable signal that sent a chill through the room. Behind the sofa in apartment 5A of the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, Portugal, Eddie had detected something the human investigators couldn't see, the scent of human decomposition. It was July 2007, 2 months after 3-year-old Madeleine McCann vanished without a trace from this very apartment. The resort had long since returned to normal operations. Tourists swam in the pools, dined at the tapas restaurant, and walked the same paths as the McCanns and their friends had on that fateful night of May 3rd. But inside apartment 5A, time stood still. What Eddie detected that day would become one of the most controversial elements of the entire investigation. And it wasn't just the cadaver scent. Forensic teams meticulously collecting evidence from behind that sofa discovered something else. Mysterious fibers, carefully bagged and sent for analysis. Fibers that would raise disturbing questions. As investigators pieced together the timeline of May 3rd, one name kept surfacing in connection with that specific area of the apartment, David Payne, a family friend of the McCanns, and one of the last people to see Madeleine alive. According to statements, Payne had visited the apartment that evening, standing in that very living room. Could these forensic discoveries, the cadaver scent and the unidentified fibers found behind the sofa, somehow be linked to David Payne? Was this merely coincidence, or something more sinister? And why, despite these alarming findings, was Payne never formally named as a suspect? Tonight, we'll examine the evidence that Portuguese police uncovered but never fully explained. Evidence that continues to haunt this unsolved mystery and raises profound questions about what really happened in apartment 5A on the night Madeleine McCann disappeared. On the evening of May 3rd, 2007, in the quiet coastal town of Praia da Luz, Portugal, a family vacation transformed into one of the most perplexing criminal investigations of the 21st century. 3-year-old Madeleine McCann vanished from her bed in apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort while her parents dined with friends at a tapas restaurant approximately 180 feet away. Madeleine's parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, both physicians from Leicestershire, England, had arrived in Portugal on April 28th for a week-long holiday with their 3 children, Madeleine and 2-year-old twins Sean and Amelie. They weren't alone. 3 other couples joined them, forming what would later become known as the Tapas 7, David and Fiona Payne, Russell O'Brien and Jane Tanner, Matthew and Rachel Oldfield, along with Diane Webster, Fiona's mother. David Payne, a 41-year-old cardiovascular researcher and close friend of the McCanns, had actually organized the trip. His relationship with the family extended beyond casual friendship. He and Jerry had known each other for years through their medical careers. This connection would later become significant as investigators scrutinized the events leading up to Madeleine's disappearance. The group established a routine during their stay. They would put their children to bed in their respective apartments, then meet for dinner at the resort's tapas restaurant, taking turns to check on the sleeping children throughout the evening. This arrangement would later draw intense criticism and scrutiny. May 3rd began as an ordinary vacation day. The adults attended a tennis lesson in the morning while the children were at the resort's kids club. Madeleine and the twins were picked up at 12:30 p.m. and spent the afternoon at the pool with Kate. Around 6 p.m., the McCann family returned to apartment 5A to begin the children's bedtime routine. What happened next remains a critical point of contention in the investigation. According to statements, David Payne visited the apartment sometime between 6:30 and 7 p.m. The purpose and duration of this visit, and even exactly what Payne saw, would later become subjects of conflicting accounts. By 8:30 p.m., Kate and Jerry reported that all 3 children were asleep, and they left to join their friends at the tapas restaurant. The group's dinner reservation was for 8:30 p.m., and they occupied a table with a partial view of the apartment block, though not of apartment 5A specifically. Throughout the evening, members of the group conducted checks on their children. Jerry McCann checked on his children at approximately 9:05 p.m. and reported everything was normal. At around 9:25 p.m., Matthew Oldfield passed by the McCann's apartment but didn't actually enter the children's bedroom. At 10 p.m., Kate McCann went to check and discovered Madeleine was missing. The bedroom window was reportedly open and the shutter raised. The alarm was raised immediately. Resort staff and guests formed search parties that combed the area until dawn. Portuguese police, the Polícia Judiciária, PJ, were called to the scene, arriving at 11:10 p.m. What followed was a cascade of investigative missteps, international media frenzy, and a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. It's fascinating to see how this case has captured attention worldwide, from Portugal to Peru, from Australia to Alaska. If you're fascinated by forensic evidence in unsolved cases, hit that subscribe button now to join our investigation community. We dive deep into the evidence that mainstream media often glosses over, examining the forensic clues that could finally break open cases like Madeleine's disappearance. As we continue, we'll explore the critical forensic discoveries made in apartment 5A, evidence that raises disturbing questions about what really happened on that May evening and whether someone within the McCann's inner circle might know more than they've revealed. Apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort appeared unremarkable at first glance, a standard holiday rental with whitewashed walls, tiled floors, and modest furnishings. But to forensic investigators, this space became a complex puzzle of potential evidence, with the living room emerging as a focal point of particular interest. The layout of the living room was simple, yet significant. A beige sofa sat positioned against a wall, near a window that faced the resort grounds. This window, with its accessible height from the outside and its sliding mechanism, would become central to various theories about how an intruder might have entered. But it was the space behind this sofa, the narrow gap between the furniture and the wall, that would yield the case's most controversial forensic discoveries. Initial police work at the scene has been widely criticized. The apartment wasn't properly secured until hours after Madeleine's disappearance was reported. Dozens of people, resort staff, search volunteers, friends and family had moved through the space, potentially contaminating evidence. Crime scene photos show officers without gloves or protective footwear. These early missteps would later cast doubt on the reliability of evidence collected. It wasn't until July 2007, more than 2 months after Madeleine vanished, that British authorities dispatched their own forensic team to Portugal. Among them was Martin Grime, a former South Yorkshire police officer and expert dog handler who arrived with 2 specially trained dogs, Eddie and Keeler. Eddie was no ordinary canine. As an enhanced victim recovery dog, EVRD, he was trained to alert to the scent of human cadaverine, a specific odor released during human decomposition. Eddie's training was rigorous and his track record impressive. He had successfully located human remains in numerous cases, some buried for years, and had never given a false positive in controlled testing environments. Keeler, his counterpart, was a crime scene investigation dog trained to detect human blood, even in microscopic amounts, even after cleaning attempts. Together, these dogs represented the cutting edge of forensic canine work. On July 31st, the dogs were brought to apartment 5A. The scene was captured on video, providing a rare documented glimpse into this investigative technique. Eddie entered the apartment and began a methodical search. In the living room, his behavior changed dramatically when he approached the area behind the sofa. The dog froze, then gave his trained alert signal, a clear indication he had detected the scent of human decomposition. This alert was specific and localized to the area behind the sofa and the lower portion of the nearby window curtains. Eddie also alerted in the McCann's bedroom and on items belonging to Kate McCann, including clothing and a stuffed toy of Madeleine's. Keeler, the blood detection dog, subsequently alerted to some of the same locations. These alerts prompted investigators to conduct a more thorough examination of the areas in question. Behind the sofa, Forensic technicians collected samples from the floor tiles and wall. They also took swabs from the hem of the curtains that hung beside the window. But perhaps most intriguing were the fibers recovered from this same location, fibers that didn't appear to match the sofa, curtains, or other textiles in the apartment. These mysterious fibers were carefully collected, documented, and sent to the Forensic Science Service, FSS, in Birmingham, England, for analysis. The FSS was tasked with determining the nature of these fibers, their composition, potential origin, and whether they might be linked to clothing worn by any persons of interest in the case. Simultaneously, samples from the areas where the dogs alerted were subjected to DNA testing. The FSS employed a technique called low copy number, LCN DNA analysis, a highly sensitive method capable of generating profiles from minute samples, but also prone to contamination and interpretation challenges. What makes these discoveries particularly significant is their location. The space behind the sofa was not an area where people typically moved or touched. It wasn't a high-traffic zone that would naturally accumulate random fibers or DNA through everyday use. Its relatively protected position made it less likely to be contaminated by the numerous people who entered the apartment after Madeleine's disappearance. Here's where the investigation takes an unexpected turn. Despite the sophisticated technology employed and the promising alerts from the cadaver dogs, the FSS results were inconclusive. The DNA samples were degraded and represented what analysts called a complex mixture that couldn't be definitively linked to any individual. The fiber analysis results, meanwhile, were never fully disclosed in public documents. Even more surprising was the discovery that no reference samples were ever collected from David Payne for comparison with the forensic evidence. Despite being one of the last people known to have been in the apartment before Madeleine's disappearance, and despite the dogs alerting to an area he potentially occupied during his visit, Payne's DNA and fiber standards were never obtained by investigators. This investigative gap raises profound questions. Was it an oversight, a deliberate decision? Or did investigators have reasons to believe the forensic evidence wasn't connected to Payne? The Portuguese police files, partially released to the public, offer no clear explanation for this omission. The forensic discoveries behind the sofa, the cadaver scent, the blood indicators, and the unidentified fibers remain among the most tantalizing yet frustrating elements of the entire Madeleine McCann investigation. They suggest something significant happened in that apartment, potentially involving human decomposition, yet the scientific analysis failed to provide the definitive answers investigators hoped for. David Payne stands as one of the most enigmatic figures in the Madeleine McCann case. A successful cardiovascular researcher with a medical background similar to the McCanns, Payne was more than just another holiday companion. He was the architect of the entire Portugal trip. His friendship with Jerry McCann stretched back years through professional connections in the medical community, and the two families had vacationed together previously. Tall, well-spoken, and described by acquaintances as intelligent and meticulous, Payne was 41 years old at the time of Madeleine's disappearance. He traveled to Portugal with his wife Fiona, their two children, and Fiona's mother, Diane Webster. Within the Tapas 7 group, the Paynes were perhaps the closest to the McCanns, with David often taking on an unofficial leadership role in group activities. What makes Payne particularly significant to the investigation is that he was reportedly the last person outside the immediate McCann family to see Madeleine alive. According to statements given to Portuguese police, Payne visited apartment 5A on the evening of May 3rd, sometime between 6:30 and 7 p.m., approximately 3 hours before Madeleine was discovered missing. The purpose of this visit, as explained in police statements, was straightforward. Jerry McCann, who was playing tennis, had asked Payne to check whether Kate needed help with the children's bedtime routine. Payne stated that he went to the apartment, spoke briefly with Kate, observed the children, and then left to prepare his own family for dinner. This visit, seemingly innocuous, became a focal point for investigators when they discovered discrepancies between Payne's account and Kate McCann's recollection of the same event. In his statement to Portuguese police on May 4, 2007, Payne described entering the apartment and seeing Kate and the 3 children. He stated that all the children were dressed in white, looking angelic, and that he spoke with Kate for about 3 to 5 minutes before leaving. He specifically mentioned observing Madeleine. When questioned again during the UK rogatory interviews in April 2008, Payne maintained this account, adding some details about the children being freshly bathed and in their pajamas. He described the scene as peaceful and ordinary. Kate McCann's recollection, however, differed in several key aspects. In her statement to Portuguese police, she initially made no mention of Payne's visit. When specifically asked about it later, she confirmed that he had come to the apartment, but estimated that he stayed for only about 30 seconds, speaking to her at the door rather than entering fully into the living room. She did not mention him seeing the children. In her 2011 book Madeleine, Kate further complicated the picture by writing that she was in the shower when Payne arrived and spoke to him wrapped in a towel, a detail absent from both her official statements and Payne's accounts. These discrepancies about the duration of the visit, whether Payne entered the apartment proper, whether he saw the children and Kate's state of dress, might seem minor in isolation. But in the context of a missing child investigation, where timeline precision is crucial, they raised red flags for investigators. The timing of Payne's visit places him in or near apartment 5A during a critical window. If Madeleine was indeed abducted by an intruder, as the McCanns believe, Payne's presence might have inadvertently deterred the perpetrator, pushing the abduction to a later time. Alternatively, if something happened to Madeleine earlier than the reported 10 p.m. discovery of her absence, Payne's visit becomes even more significant. What makes this visit particularly intriguing in relation to the forensic evidence is the location. If Payne entered the apartment and stood in the living room as he claimed, he would have been in proximity to the sofa, the same area where 2 months later cadaver dogs would alert and mysterious fibers would be found. Portuguese investigators noted these discrepancies but never formally designated Payne as an arguido official suspect. They did, however, seize his phone records and analyze his movements throughout the week. British police, conducting interviews on behalf of the Portuguese investigation in 2008, questioned Payne extensively about his visit to apartment 5A, suggesting they too recognized its potential significance. What time is it where you're watching? Our evidence timeline is crucial in this case, and just like we're examining the exact minutes and movements on May 3, 2007, I'm curious about the moment in time when you're joining this investigation from your corner of the world. If you want to see more in-depth forensic analyses like this one, smash that like button and leave a comment below. Your engagement helps our channel reach more people interested in the forensic truth behind high-profile cases, and it lets me know which aspects of these investigations you find most compelling. As we continue to unravel this case, we'll next examine how investigators handled these forensic discoveries and what the laboratory analyses revealed about the mysterious findings behind the sofa in apartment 5A. The Portuguese police response to Madeleine's disappearance has been widely criticized, particularly regarding their handling of forensic evidence. In the crucial first hours, the apartment was not properly secured as a crime scene, a fundamental error that potentially compromised evidence collection. Dozens of people moved through the space, touching surfaces and potentially contaminating trace evidence before proper forensic protocols were established. When Portuguese investigators finally conducted a thorough forensic examination of apartment 5A, they employed standard techniques: luminol testing for blood traces, fingerprint collection, and basic fiber recovery. However, their approach to the evidence found behind the sofa reveals the limitations of their forensic capabilities at the time. The Polizia Judiciaria, PJ, collected samples from the floor tiles and wall behind the sofa, as well as from the hem of the nearby curtains. They documented and photographed the scene, but their initial analysis was limited by the resources available in Portugal. This led to a critical decision that would shape the investigation, sending the most promising samples to the UK's Forensic Science Service, FSS, for advanced analysis. The FSS, based in Birmingham, England, was then considered one of the world's leading forensic laboratories. With cutting-edge DNA technology and extensive experience in complex cases, The FSS represented the best chance for extracting usable evidence from the samples collected in apartment 5A. The samples from behind the sofa arrived at the FSS in August 2007, along with other evidence from the apartment and the McCann's rental car. The laboratory employed a technique called low copy number, LCN DNA analysis, a method capable of generating profiles from just a few cells of biological material. This technique was particularly appropriate for the samples from behind the sofa, which contained minimal visible material. What happened next represents one of the most controversial aspects of the entire investigation. The FSS analysis of the samples from behind the sofa yielded results that were at best ambiguous. The DNA recovered was degraded and represented what analysts called a complex mixture of genetic material from multiple individuals. The quantity and quality of the DNA were insufficient to generate a complete profile that could be definitively matched to any specific person. The fiber evidence underwent a separate analysis process. Forensic fiber analysis typically involves microscopic examination, chemical testing, and comparison with reference samples. The fibers found behind the sofa were subjected to this standard protocol, but a surprising revelation emerged. No reference samples had been collected from key individuals for comparison. This oversight is particularly baffling in a missing person investigation. Standard procedure would dictate collecting fiber standards from the clothing of all persons who had been in the apartment, especially those present on the day of disappearance. Yet the case files indicate that no such samples were taken from David Payne or other members of the Tapas 7. Without these reference samples, the fiber evidence, potentially crucial, became effectively unusable for identifying who might have been behind that sofa. The FSS faced additional challenges in their analysis. The samples had been collected more than 2 months after Madeleine's disappearance, during which time the apartment had been cleaned and reoccupied by other tourists. Environmental factors like humidity, cleaning products, and normal degradation likely affected the quality of any biological material present. In September 2007, FSS scientist John Lowe sent a report to the Portuguese authorities regarding the DNA analysis. His conclusions were cautious and heavily caveated. While some DNA markers consistent with Madeleine's profile were detected in certain samples, Lowe emphasized that these results were inconclusive and could not be used to definitively place Madeleine or anyone else in the locations where the dogs had alerted. This report represented a significant setback for the Portuguese investigation, which had been building a case heavily reliant on the forensic evidence. Without conclusive DNA results to corroborate the cadaver dog alerts, the evidentiary value of the discoveries behind the sofa diminished substantially. Perhaps the most surprising revelation about the evidence handling came years later, when it emerged that the FSS had destroyed many of the original samples after the Portuguese investigation was archived in 2008. This standard procedure for completed cases meant that when Operation Grange began in 2011, British investigators could not retest the samples using newer, more sensitive techniques that had been developed in the intervening years. The handling of the forensic evidence from behind the sofa exemplifies the broader challenges of the Madeleine McCann investigation. Promising leads that couldn't be conclusively developed, technological limitations that prevented definitive answers, and procedural decisions that closed off investigative avenues before they could be fully explored. The Portuguese authorities, facing intense international media scrutiny and working with limited resources, ultimately could not transform the alerts behind the sofa into actionable evidence. The fibers remained unidentified, the DNA inconclusive, and the significance of this location, so prominently highlighted by Eddie's alert, unresolved in the official investigation. The Madeleine McCann case is riddled with contradictions that have fueled debate for years. When we examine the witness accounts surrounding the events of May 3, 2007, these inconsistencies become particularly apparent. Beyond the discrepancies in David Payne's and Kate McCann's accounts of the evening visit, other witness statements contain troubling contradictions. Jane Tanner, another member of the Tapas 7, reported seeing a man carrying a child near the McCann's apartment around 9:15 p.m., a sighting that was initially treated as a potential abductor. Years later, Scotland Yard's Operation Grange identified this figure as an innocent tourist carrying his own child back from the resort's night creche, effectively eliminating what had been considered a key sighting. Similarly, the statements from the Smith family, Irish tourists who reported seeing a man carrying a child toward the beach around 10 p.m., initially seemed promising. Martin Smith even suggested the man resembled Jerry McCann in his gait and build, though he later distanced himself from this identification. These conflicting witness accounts have made establishing a reliable timeline nearly impossible. When we turn to the forensic evidence, particularly the cadaver dog alerts behind the sofa, multiple explanations emerge. Proponents of the McCanns point to several alternative explanations for Eddie's alerts. First, false positives are possible with any detection dog. While Eddie had an impressive track record, no detection method is infallible. Critics note that cadaver dogs are trained to alert to the scent of human decomposition, but this scent begins developing within 90 minutes to 3 hours after death. Madeleine was reported missing at 10 p.m., and the search began immediately. This timeline creates a narrow window for decomposition odor to develop if she died in the apartment that evening. Second, contamination could explain the alerts. Apartment 5A had been occupied by multiple tenants before and after the McCanns. Portuguese investigators confirmed that at least one previous occupant had died of natural causes several weeks after staying there, though not in the apartment itself. Could residual scent have somehow transferred to the apartment? Forensic experts remain divided on this possibility. Third, cross-contamination from the McCann's medical profession presents another theory. Both Kate and Jerry were physicians who had contact with deceased patients. Could they have inadvertently transferred cadaverine molecules to items in the apartment? Some experts suggest this is unlikely given the washing of clothes and hands, but others maintain it's possible. Fourth, the alerts might have detected historical decomposition unrelated to Madeleine. The apartment building was several decades old. Could the dogs have detected decomposition from a previous, unrecorded death in the building, perhaps from someone who died behind that wall years earlier? As for the mysterious fibers found behind the sofa, their origin remains one of the case's most tantalizing unknowns. The Portuguese police files released to the public contain minimal information about these fibers, and the FSS analysis results were never fully disclosed. Several possibilities exist for these fibers. They could have come from clothing worn by an intruder who accessed the apartment through the nearby window, shedding fibers as they moved through the tight space behind the sofa. They might have originated from David Payne's clothing during his visit, deposited as he moved through the living room, though this would require him to have been in closer proximity to the sofa than some accounts suggest. They could be transfer fibers from the McCanns or their children, deposited during normal activities, and somehow migrating to the space behind the sofa. They might be unrelated to the case entirely, perhaps fibers from previous occupants or cleaning staff that accumulated in an area rarely cleaned. Without the full forensic analysis or comparison samples from key individuals, determining the fiber's origin remains speculative. What makes this particularly frustrating is that fiber evidence can be highly discriminating when properly analyzed. Modern forensic techniques can identify not just the type of fiber, but often the specific manufacturer and even dye lot, potentially linking fibers to specific garments. The Portuguese investigation's decision not to collect reference samples from David Payne for comparison with these fibers represents a significant missed opportunity. Whether this was an oversight or a deliberate investigative choice remains unclear from the available documentation. What's your theory about these contradictions? Drop it in the comments. The collective intelligence of true crime communities has helped solve cases before, and your perspective might highlight connections others have missed. If you're finding this analysis valuable, help others discover it by sharing this video right now. The more eyes we have examining these details, the greater chance we have of finally understanding what happened to Madeleine McCann. These contradictions and alternative explanations don't necessarily exonerate or implicate any particular individual. Rather, they illustrate the complexity of this case and the challenges investigators faced in interpreting evidence that was, by its nature, ambiguous and open to multiple interpretations. The Portuguese investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance officially concluded on July 21, 2008, when the case was archived as unsolved. The handling of the forensic evidence, particularly the cadaver dog alerts and fiber evidence from behind the sofa, reveals much about the investigation's trajectory and limitations. Portuguese authorities initially treated the cadaver dog evidence with significant weight. The PJ files indicate that after Eddie and Keela alerted in apartment 5A and to items belonging to the McCanns, the investigation's focus shifted dramatically toward the parents as suspects. This pivot was reinforced when the dogs later alerted to the McCanns' rental car, a vehicle they had leased 24 days after Madeleine's disappearance. However, the evidentiary value of these alerts diminished substantially when the FSS laboratory analysis failed to provide corroborating scientific evidence. The DNA results from behind the sofa and other alert locations were deemed inconclusive, showing only partial degraded profiles that could not be definitively linked to Madeleine or any specific individual. In Portuguese legal proceedings, dog alerts alone are not considered sufficient evidence to support criminal charges. They are viewed as intelligence tools that can guide investigators to potential evidence, but not as evidence themselves. Without corroborating forensic findings, the legal weight of Eddie's alerts behind the sofa was minimal. The fiber evidence suffered a similar fate. While the fibers were collected and analyzed, the results were never publicly disclosed in detail. The Portuguese final report makes only passing reference to them, suggesting they did not yield investigatively significant information. Whether this was due to inconclusive analysis, contamination issues, or simply a lack of reference samples for comparison remains unclear. Despite the intriguing timing of David Payne's visit to apartment 5A and the discrepancies in accounts about this visit, he was never formally named as an arguido, official suspect, in the Portuguese investigation. Several factors likely contributed to this decision. First, there was no direct evidence linking Payne to Madeleine's disappearance. The forensic findings behind the sofa could not be definitively connected to him without reference samples, which were never collected. Second, Payne had alibis for the critical period when Madeleine was discovered missing. Multiple witnesses placed him at the Tapas restaurant from approximately 8:30 p.m. onward on May 3rd. Third, the investigation's focus had shifted primarily to the McCanns themselves by August 2007, with limited resources directed toward exploring other avenues. Fourth, under Portuguese law, designating someone as an arguido requires substantial evidence of involvement in a crime, a threshold that investigators evidently did not believe was met in Payne's case. When the case was archived in 2008, Portuguese prosecutor José de Magalhães e Menezes concluded that the investigation had not produced any evidence of the involvement of the McCanns or any of the Tapas 7 in Madeleine's disappearance. The archiving dispatch specifically noted the inconclusive nature of the forensic evidence and the lack of corroboration for the cadaver dog alerts. The case entered a new phase in 2011 when, at the request of the McCanns, the British government launched Operation Grange, a review that later became a full investigation by the Metropolitan Police. With a budget exceeding $11 million, Operation Grange re-examined all evidence and pursued new leads. Interestingly, Operation Grange appears to have given little weight to the cadaver dog evidence or the fibers found behind the sofa. Their investigative focus shifted toward an abduction scenario, with resources directed at identifying potential suspects outside the McCann social circle. In 2020, the case took another turn when German prosecutors announced they were investigating Christian Bruckner, a convicted sex offender who was in Praia da Luz when Madeleine disappeared. German authorities stated they believe Madeleine is dead and that Bruckner was involved, though they have not yet disclosed the evidence supporting these conclusions. This development introduces a completely new perspective. If Bruckner or another unknown intruder was responsible for Madeleine's disappearance, how do we explain the cadaver dog alerts behind the sofa? Could there be a connection between these alerts and Bruckner that investigators haven't yet identified? Or are the alerts indeed false positives or the result of contamination? Despite these investigations spanning more than a decade and 3 countries, crucial questions remain unanswered. What exactly were the fibers found behind the sofa, and why weren't reference samples collected from all potential persons of interest, including David Payne? If the cadaver dogs were alerting to actual human decomposition, how did it come to be in those specific locations, including behind the sofa? Why do the accounts of Payne's visit to apartment 5A on May 3rd contain discrepancies? And what is the significance of these inconsistencies? If Madeleine was abducted by an intruder, did they enter through the window near the sofa, potentially explaining the fiber evidence? These questions persist not because of a lack of investigative effort, but because the evidence itself is ambiguous, the witness accounts contradictory, and the forensic findings inconclusive. The space behind that sofa in apartment 5A remains metaphorically a gap in our understanding of what happened to Madeleine McCann. As we separate the known facts from speculation in the case of Madeleine McCann, one thing becomes clear. The evidence found behind the sofa in apartment 5A represents both the promise and limitations of forensic science in complex investigations. What we know with certainty is limited. Cadaver dogs alerted behind the sofa and to the nearby curtains. Unidentified fibers were collected from this location, and David Payne visited the apartment on the evening of May 3rd, though accounts of this visit differ. Laboratory analysis of the samples taken from behind the sofa proved inconclusive, and the fiber evidence remains largely unexplained in public documents. Beyond these established facts lies a vast territory of speculation that has fueled countless theories about Madeleine's fate. The space behind that sofa has become emblematic of the entire case, a narrow gap filled with ambiguous evidence that points towards something significant but refuses to yield definitive answers. The forensic discoveries behind the sofa matter because they represent one of the few pieces of physical evidence in a case otherwise dominated by witness statements and circumstantial information. Had the fibers been conclusively identified, had reference samples been collected from all relevant individuals, or had the DNA analysis yielded clearer results, the investigation might have taken a very different path. Instead, we're left with questions that may never be answered unless new evidence emerges or someone with direct knowledge of Madeleine's fate comes forward. The German investigation into Christian Brückner may yet provide resolution, but until then the mystery of what happened in apartment 5A remains open. What's the weather like where you're watching? We're always working on new cases regardless of rain or shine, and knowing our global community is out there, from sunny Australia to rainy London, from snowy Canada to tropical Brazil, reminds us why we do this work. The search for truth transcends borders and weather patterns alike. For more unsolved mysteries and forensic deep dives, subscribe to Criminal Instinct now and hit the notification bell. Our community of critical thinkers and true crime enthusiasts is growing every day, and together we're shining light on cases that might otherwise remain in shadow. Join us as we continue to examine the evidence that others miss and ask the questions that demand answers.